Hello again everybody, and welcome to another look at a project in development for DCS World. And this week I have this brand new screenshot of Tonopah Test Range Airfield that was provided by the developers. This is still work in progress, but it does show steps being taken to lay out the parking locations on the ramp and to add some appropriate facilities around the airfield. This may not have the notoriety of the Groom Lake facility with all the developmental testing and first flights that have taken place there, but in terms of appropriate locations to fly the aircraft that we have in DCS World out of, specifically the MiG-21 and the F-5 in an adversary role, this is the location to do it from. So what I'll do for the rest of this video is have a closer look at Tonopah Test Range Airfield and the history behind it, why it was built, what's been done there, and what kind of missions we can expect to fly out of there. And well, I'll start with the screenshot itself. This is taken from the north end of the airfield looking south, and right in front of us we can see the area known as the Canyon, these rows of hangars that were built in the early 80s to house the F-117 fleet, and in fact some of them still do house F-117s, just in various states of storage. And then looking to the south, beyond the control tower, we see the original hangars that were built in the late 70s for the Constant Peg program, and that's where I'll start because aggressor operations, particularly with the MiG-21, is what I would expect the focus to be in any upcoming DCS World campaigns or missions. So when thinking about how this big operating location in the middle of nowhere came to be, it really started with a project called Constant Peg. And I know many of you are familiar with this through the book Red Eagles by Steve Davies, the same author who provided the general outline and the story for the Red Flag campaigns that are currently available. But this project was really born out of lessons learned from Vietnam and a late 70s push for more realistic combat training for Air Force and Allied pilots. And what could be more realistic than flying against actual enemy aircraft in the hands of US pilots who know the aircraft capabilities and know the tactics to be used by the Soviet Union at the time. So these MiGs, and initially MiG-17s and MiG-21s, then eventually MiG-23s, were already present at the Groom Lake facility in strictly a flight test and evaluation role, with the idea behind Constant Peg to take them out of the test world and make them more accessible as a training tool, and that's where Tonopah comes into play. A location was needed that was remote enough not to attract too much attention, but was still accessible to the airspace and the ranges, and Tonopah Test Range Airfield was selected as that location. All that was there originally is an airstrip with a turnaround point at the end used by the Department of Energy. They actually administer Tonopah Test Range. So the first order of business for Constant Peg when they moved in was to build some facilities down on the south end of the airfield. And this was originally just hangars in which to park the aircraft, other basic facilities off the ramp for component maintenance, and fabrication of basic parts. These weren't aircraft where you could just go to the supply section and order a part. They had to make a lot of the stuff on site or contract out fabrication of more complex items. And then a place to live out of called the Man Camp, because a typical work week for these guys would be to fly in on a Monday, live and operate out of Tonopah through the week, and then fly back to their homes in Las Vegas for the weekend. Now there's obviously a lot more to the Tonopah Test Range Airfield than just the Constant Peg or the Red Eagles ramp down to the south, because they were really clever in the way that they did the funding for building up Tonopah. It wasn't just Constant Peg. They piggybacked a lot of this on the Senior Trend program, or the stand-up of the F-117s, and worked it so that the majority of the funding for the airfield, for the new runway, much of the additional ramp space, the terminal for flying personnel in and out of there, all came from the F-117s, who also, coincidentally at the same time, needed a place to bed down. But more on that later, because starting in 1977 and then going all the way through 1988, these MiGs would fly out of Tonopah and expose Allied pilots to the experience of seeing a MiG in person for the first time. The idea being to get that experience out of the way so that in the event that it does happen in the future, in a real-world environment, that initial shock has already worn off and you know what to expect because you've already been there in a training environment. And these would usually consist of the person being exposed, receiving a briefing beforehand, and then flying up to the range, usually out of Nellis, link up with one or more of the MiGs and receive an orientation that would consist of, depending on the aircraft, for example, a MiG-17 pilot might demonstrate the turning capability of that aircraft, or a person in a MiG-21 might intentionally fly the aircraft in a way to demonstrate just how difficult it can be to see the aircraft. A MiG-23 pilot might throttle up and engage the afterburners to show the acceleration capability of that aircraft, just basic items to get the point across. And then from there, it would just turn into a typical dogfighting training environment, with the aircraft extending away from each other and then turning back into a fight, with the Allied pilot trying to apply all the lessons that have been learned so far, and the MiG pilot trying to fly the aircraft in a way that mimicked Soviet tactics and then use the aircraft to all of its advantages in an attempt to really hammer home those lessons on the trainee. The other very typical scenario would be to have these MiGs flying as part of the Red Flag exercise as adversary aircraft. And if you've flown the Red Flag campaigns that are already in DCS world, the storyline there, albeit with MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s, I'm sure is inspired directly from constant peg operations in support of the Red Flags. In fact, the project had ground control intercept GCI controllers assigned that for these types of exercises would vector MiGs onto the Red Flag strike packages using Soviet techniques and tactics in, again, a very realistic environment. So, like all good things, this did eventually come to an end, like I mentioned, in 1988, and it's kind of easy to see why. The MiG-21s and MiG-23s that would have been in use up until that point, the MiG-17s were phased out in the early 80s. These older style MiGs didn't really reflect the primary threat coming online at that point, with MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s entering service. So the question of whether the funding that was required to maintain this sort of program and maintain it in secrecy, that's really the key here. It's much, much more expensive to run a program like this in secret than it is to run it in the open. The benefits and pilot training that came from this no longer justified the cost, and the program was shut down at that point. Many of the aircraft were then returned to the rightful owners. A lot of these were just sort of borrowed from other countries, or were distributed around the US to different museums and different display locations. If you have ever really made the rounds of aviation museums in the US, you'll know that there are just a large number of MiGs that for years and years people would sort of scratch their heads over, suspecting where they came from, but then once the Constant Peg program was declassified, a lot of these started to be identified specifically with MiGs that were used here. Now, I also mentioned that as all this was going on, Senior Trend and the F-117s were setting up shop in the canyon on the north side of the airfield, and since I have the reference photos already, and incidentally, these photos and the sort of overhead locators that you see are some of the reference photos being used by the team to make Tonopah as accurate as possible, or as accurate as feasible, considering exactly what source material is available. There aren't that many photos that are of Tonopah test range facilities. A lot of those you see on the internet are actually either Holloman Air Force Base or Al Jaber Air Base in Kuwait, just misidentified as Tonopah, with those you see here being, well, such as they are, the best that are available. Initial F-117 operations out of Tonopah started in 1982, just a couple years after the Constant Peg MiGs started operating. It started as a very, very small operation, and then as more F-117s rolled off the assembly line, there were enough aircraft here to constitute 2 operational squadrons and 1 training squadron. Basically an entire wing-sized operation operating out of this airfield. Now, the F-117s operated at night while the MiGs flew during the day, with the F-117s flying out of these hangars in the canyon area up to the north. These are flow-through hangars with doors on either end, so when flying from these, I would expect to start up and shut down within the hangars, just taxiing in and out at the beginning and end of a mission. And as you can see, there's no lack of parking locations on this airfield, with at least 54 in the canyon area and then more on the other side of the airfield to the south. Now, one item that you'll notice inside the hangars that I think is kind of neat anyway is the flag draped over the entrance. And this is one of those pieces of F-117 tradition that made the transition from Tonopah to Holloman Air Force Base, where F-117 maintainers of my generation at least operated out of. But the idea, as it was always explained to me, is that the flags were hung here to keep Soviet satellites from being able to look down obliquely, sort of from the side and into the hangar, and to be able to see what's there. Now, a lot of maintenance on the F-117 could be done completely indoors with the doors closed, but there are always going to be situations where you need to crack the door to get whatever equipment in and out that needed to happen. And with the flag there, anything trying to look in through the open door would either be blocked by the hangars in front of it or would be blocked by the flag. It's actually very, very creative. And like I said, that tradition did carry over to Holloman Air Force Base when the fleet moved to that more permanent location following acknowledgement of the program and operations in Desert Storm. And then, of course, in 2006, the final chapter of the F-117 and its association with Tonopah was written as the fleet was, as you can see here, packed back into the hangars and tucked away for good. So this part of the airfield doesn't apply as directly as the southern end when it comes to operations that we're capable of in DCS world, and believe me, nothing would make me happier than to see an F-117 module come along. The discussion that always turns up whenever the possibility is brought up is that either A, the aircraft is too classified to be modeled, which is simply not the case, or B, that it just wouldn't be fun from a gameplay perspective, which again is mind-boggling to me as someone who remembers the gameplay from the old F-117 2.0 original flight sim. I can't imagine anything more fun than sneaking in and out of a target area in an F-117, but well, then again, I guess I am a little bit biased. But in either case, the Tonopah facilities that are there do give us a lot of opportunity to park and be creative with missions of any type flying out of Tonopah on the DCS World terrain. So folks, I'm going to wrap this one up here, and that's just a quick look at work in progress on Tonopah Test Range Airfield, and then some background on operations that were conducted out of there and how that could apply to modules and situations that we have within DCS World. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.